In today's video, we're going to fill a sketchbook spread with some simple fall watercolor illustrations. I've been sharing a ton of fall-themed tutorials over the past couple of months, so definitely check those videos out for more detailed tutorials, but today we're going to paint a mix of fall elements, and we're going to do it in more of a cutesy illustrative style. So grab your favorite sketchbook, make yourself a cup of cider or a pumpkin spice latte, and let's start painting. All the supplies I'm using in today's video are linked down below in the description box, so if you're curious what paint or sketchbook or brushes I'm using, be sure to take a look there. So I already sketched out some basic outlines of each little element that we'll be painting, but as I paint them, I'll put the sketch on screen so you can reference them as we go. I brought you in a bit closer so you can see all the little illustrations better, but I'm going to work my way from left to right across this entire sketchbook spread. So instead of working on one element at a time, we're just going to go left to right. And so I'm going to start with the little mushrooms up here at the top. I'm going to start by completely wetting this top section, and I'm just wetting the very top and leaving a little bit of a white space here for where I'm going to put the little stringy parts of the mushroom. I don't know the official terms for it, but I'm just wetting the part that's going to be red, which is the very top little mushroom cap, and then a bit of that red that you can see behind. So just putting down a clean, even layer of water, and then I'm going to go ahead and pick up my red color. I'm using a mix of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake. And I'm going to just drop in some of this red on the areas that I want it to be nice and dark. I'm not going to fill in the entire mushroom cap. I'm just going to drop some of it in up at the very top, along this bottom side, and then of course for this back edge, which is just going to be a little line, just like that. It's just the back of the mushroom cap, so we're only seeing a little sliver of it. And I want to make sure I don't fill in the entire cap because I want to have a nice little gradient from light to dark. So I'll rinse off my brush so I have clean bristles and just kind of smooth some of that out a bit. Again, I want to maintain some of that light area right around here. I'm not going for super detailed or realistic, so I don't need it to be perfect, but I do want to avoid any of these illustrations looking very flat, and usually that happens when you don't have a variety of values. So I have some light values and I have some dark values. So I'm going to go back in and tap in a little bit more of this dark bold pigment. This is the darkest value, and I'm only placing it in those areas that I want to be nice and dark. Rinsing off my brush and smoothing some of that out. There's going to be a lot of back and forth between adding more pigment, smoothing it out. Sometimes we might have to use the lifting technique to lift some color off the page if it gets too dark. But I find that it's a nice mixture between loose illustration and a little bit more realistic, is having at least some highlights and shadows. So that, again, it's not flat, but it's not too perfect or detailed. And that's about it. I want this to dry completely before we add any of the little white polka dots on it. So I'm going to do the same exact thing on the smaller mushroom cap right next to it, and then we'll add the stem and the little details. So once again, starting with a base layer that's just clear water. Mine has a little bit of the red residue left in my brush, so it's not perfectly clear, but just want to add in a base layer so that when we add in the darker pigment, it bleeds nicely. And once again, when you have that dark pigment in your brush, you'll just start to tap it along those areas that you want to be dark, and see, because we had that layer already of water, the paint does a lot of the work for us and just starts to bleed out into the rest of the mushroom cap. I'm being mindful not to add too much color here. I want to maintain some of that highlight, which is a light value. It's basically just the clean water that we already added. So I don't want to add too much color here, only in those areas that I want to be the darkest. Rinsing off my brush again and gently smoothing it out. You'll see my brush going out of screen quite a bit. I'm just rinsing off my bristles so that I have clean water to blend with. So now we'll move on to the little mushroom stems. I'm going to use a kind of an odd mixture from an art philosophy palette that I have, but it's a very warm orangey brown and then some dark bold brown as well. Again, I will have these colors linked down below if you want to use the exact ones I'm using, but any shade of gray or brown or like a caramely brown will work just fine. And same thing here, I'm going to start with just a base layer of clean water. I usually like to start with water in illustrations like these, just so I have a even surface to start layering my color onto, and then start with a pretty light value. So I'm using my caramely reddish brown, and I just want to tap in a little bit of color along the edge, on the top and the bottom. We're going to be doing a few layers of this, so it always looks a little bit funky when you just add it like this, but we'll be adding additional layers on top to really build out those shadows and bring this mushroom to life a little bit. Going in with slightly darker value. And I'll say this again, I'm not going for ultra realistic paintings. These are just cute little illustrations, so it does not have to be perfect. And then before it dries, I'm going to go in with a dark chocolatey brown and add a little bit of that darker pigment just in certain areas. Just like we did with the mushroom cap, I want to maintain some of that light value in the stem. So I don't want to go overboard, but I just want to make the contrast a little bit sharper in those areas that I'm adding shadows. So just carefully tapping some of that in. And let's do the same thing on the one right next to it. Starting with a pretty clear layer of water. You can see I have some of that brown residue still, so it's not perfectly clear, but it's still light enough. And then I do two different layers of shadows. This first one has more of the caramely warm brown. Again, this is from my art philosophy palette, but you can use gray if you want. I just like these warmer tones. Adding it up at the top and then on one edge of the stem. As I do this, I'm rinsing off my brush pretty frequently so that I can blend out with clean water. And then I go back in with that chocolatey brown and really deepen some of those areas. I'm going to add some of the darker values up here too as it dries. Really just being mindful of my water control. I don't want it to be out of control where I have so much water that it just turns into blobs, or that the dark brown floods the surface. I definitely don't want that. So you can keep an eye on it as it dries. You can always go back in and tap in some more. But we're really just establishing these base layers, adding the highlights and the shadows, and then we can go back in once everything is dry and add details. Okay, brought you in even closer so you can see this part a little better. I'm using the very tip of my brush and I'm using black. This is carbon black. And I'm going to add some subtle little details. So I'm starting with this almost kind of a leaf shape. I'm doing light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. And then off of that line, I'm using the very tip of my brush and a super light hand. And I'm just going to add in these wispy little marks. And they're kind of fanning around. So they're always starting from that center little leaf shape that we did and then working their way outwards. Keeping my hand nice and light, not applying too much pressure, and just adding in a bit of texture here for the underside of this mushroom cap. Just like that. So it's simple, it doesn't have to be perfect. We'll do the same thing over here. So starting light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. That's the shadow underneath this. And then using the tip of my brush and applying these tiny little lines for the underside. Now before the next step, make sure it's completely dry, and you can use gouache. I'm using white gouache. You could use white watercolor paint if you keep it nice and opaque. You can use an acrylic pen or acrylic paint. But all we're going to do is add some fun little white dots to the red part of this mushroom cap. I don't want them to be lined up perfectly. I don't want them to all look the same. Some of them are kind of curving over the edge here where it's folding over. Some of them are smaller. Some of them I'm applying a bit more pressure, But you're just gonna work your way around this little mushroom cap, adding in these fun little polka dots. So I'm just making sure to vary the amounts of pressure. I'm angling my brush in different ways, not overthinking it, and just gently tapping in some little dots to this mushroom cap. Let's do the same thing on the other side. I'm using a size 2 brush, so it's nice and small, and I'll do the same thing. So sometimes I'm really pushing down like this so that my brush creates a bigger mark. Sometimes I'm only using the tip of my brush and just barely tapping it to make sure it looks very organic. And there we go. We have 2 cute little mushrooms, and now we can move on to the pumpkin. I will link another pumpkin tutorial up at the top. We've painted quite a few pumpkins in my tutorials over the past couple of weeks. This one's gonna be pretty simple. So once again, I'm gonna start with a thin layer of water, and I'm only going to add that on this first little oval. So I'm staying within this little oval pumpkin section, and I'm going to work one section at a time. So make sure your first layer of water is always nice and even. I don't want to see any pools, but I also want enough to when I add my pigment, it generates those nice, beautiful blooms. I'm going to use a similar mixture of cadmium yellow deep with quin sienna, and I'm going to line the outer edges of this little section. So once again, because we already added that layer of water, you can see that color kind of start to bleed out into the center. And we're going to be smoothing this out even more, but having that first layer really does the initial work for us. So I'll rinse off my brush, tap off any excess water, and then start to smooth this out a bit. So just feathering out those edges, and I want to keep my values in mind as I do these pumpkin sections. The center is going to be the lightest, that's where it's coming out towards us, and then these outer edges and the top and bottom, that's where the shadows are. And that will really help us develop a beautiful, kind of semi-realistic looking pumpkin when this is all done. So I'll tap in some more color and do one more little round of smoothing things out using clean water and running my bristles along the edge to create a beautiful little gradient here. Now I'm gonna skip this next section here and work on the third one because this is still wet, so I don't want it to just all blend together. So once again, I'll start with a clean layer of water on this outer section. It's just a crescent moon shape. We're going to add those darker shadows at the base, along that inner edge of the crescent moon, and then the outer edge. So it's not a full oval, but we're still indicating those shadows on either side of this little section. And I talk more about this in that pumpkin tutorial, so if you struggle with painting this pumpkin, definitely check that one out. You get a lot of good practice with adding highlights and shadows to pumpkins in that one. I'm not going for a super realistic look here, but I do want to still be able to see where those shadows are. Once again, I'm just mainly trying to make sure none of these illustrations in this entire sketchbook spread look flat or dull. So I like to include some variation in value to avoid that. Let's rinse off our brush and work on the other side. I'm skipping a section again and starting with that first layer of water. And you can do a lot of these layers if you really want to make it detailed, but I want this spread to look fun and whimsical, so keeping things fairly loose. Like I said, kind of a balance between loose and realistic in all of these little illustrations. But just kind of going back and forth between tapping in the darker colors where I want the shadows to be, and then smoothing it out with clean water. And we'll go back in with the final little layer of details once everything dries, but I really want to really just block in these shadows in our first couple of layers. So I'm going back in, deepening any areas that I want to be darker, and making sure that I maintain that light value where the highlight of this pumpkin section is. Once these are dry, go ahead and do the same exact thing to these intersections. Just be careful, make sure everything's dry, practice your water control, start with that first layer, and then tap in pigment where you want the shadows to be. Now I'm going to switch over to that same caramely brown I used for the first layer of the mushroom stem for my pumpkin stem. And you can make these really however you want. I just like to keep them kind of short and then add a little bit of a curve to it. So I'm starting with a light value for this first layer. You'll start to notice a trend. I'm doing a lot of layers for all these illustrations so that they can have a pretty cohesive look. So starting with that very light base layer and then tapping in some of that darker brown at the base and where this stem is kind of twisting and turning. Now I'm going to give that some time to dry and then we'll add some final little texture to the stem, but these orange sections are just about dry. They're not fully dry yet, but this is a great time to add one final layer of details. So I'm going pretty dark here. I'm using quite a bit of my Quin Sienna, mixing it with my Cadmium Yellow Deep, and I'm just going to darken these shadows even more. So right where all of these intersect, I'm going and adding a fine line to really deepen these shadows. You don't have to do this part if you're liking how yours is looking. Again, I just like to add this final layer. I've always been a fan of bold contrast, so that's just a stylistic choice I'm making, but if you want to keep yours pretty nice and smooth, you don't have to do this part. And if you do this step, just make sure as you add additional layers, you still maintain the light value for the highlight. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to pencil in a couple little back sections to this pumpkin. That's something I didn't add. So they're just kind of crescent moons flipped on their side, and that's going to help give some more perspective. So I'm just loading up some of this dark burnt orange and filling that in. It doesn't have to be perfect. They're kind of in the back, so they're going to be a bit darker. But I think it just adds a little bit of dimension to our painting. And for the final little step, let's add some texture onto the stem. So I'm using my dark brown, same dark brown that I used for the very dark shadows there on the mushroom. And I'm just adding some twisting little lines to show that this little stem has some texture and it's kind of twisting like it's on a vine. So I'm adding the darkest parts down here at the bottom and then just gently adding some of those texture lines. And there's our pumpkin. So we'll move on to the little oak leaf up next. So for the oak leaf, my illustration, I kind of wanted it to look very scattered and whimsical across these two pages. So mine is slanted and it's upside down. If that throws you off, you can always just turn your sketchbook around. But I'm going to start by adding a thin layer of water across the entire thing. Now this one is going to be a lot more loose and a lot less detailed and layered than these first two illustrations we did. So once you have that base layer, you can really use any colors you want for this. You can mix up any sort of fall color palette that you like. I'm going to start with a green. It's kind of a mossy green. It's green gold mixed with some raw umber and some Payne's gray. And I'm taking a pretty deep mixture of that. So it's a dark value, which means it's more concentrated. And I'm going to start tapping that in. You can see it's expanding out into the base layer of water, but I'm going to line the edge of just one little section of this leaf. So just a little section like that, kind of lining the very edge. I'm going to load up some more of that green color, and I'm going to add some down here at the bottom. It really doesn't matter where you add it. We're making this very loose and expressive and letting the water do a lot of the work for us, which is always a fun way to do it. So I don't want the entire leaf to be green, but I do want just certain sections to be a bit darker. You can also add some at the top. And I don't want you to feel like you have to add your color exactly where I am. This is a very loose style of painting. So have fun with it and drop in color wherever you want. I'm going to switch over to my Cadmium Yellow Deep, and I'll do the same thing, adding some of this color in those areas that are just clear water as of now. So lining some of the outer edges. If your water starts to dry and you're not getting those bleeds, you can always just re-wet it. But this is my favorite part, just tapping in some of this color, letting the colors be manipulated by the water, and just kind of, you have to let go of control on paintings like this. and it creates just such beautiful blends and bleeds of color. If you try to control it too much, it's not going to look very good. That's at least in my experience. The more I let go of control when I'm going for this style of loose painting, the better it usually turns out. I'm also going to add in a bit of this red mixture, same red that I've used in the mushroom caps and also for the pumpkin shadows. I don't want too much of this because it's a pretty bright color, but I'm just going to tap some in along certain little areas. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush so I have completely clean water. I also switched out my water jar, so it's fully clean water. It was starting to get a little bit too muddy after all of the blending we were doing in the first couple ones. So using clean water here, and I'm just softening out any edges. Let's go ahead and let this dry once you've finished adding in your colors, and then we can add the stem and the little details. Once it's nice and dry, I'm loading up a very dark value of the same green mixture. Again, that's green gold, raw umber, and a little bit of Payne's gray. So it's a very dark, deep color. And I'm going to add a little bit of a stem here that gets slightly bigger at the bottom, which is really the top of this painting since the leaf's upside down. But I'm going to add in some very faint little dainty lines. They're not faint in color because it's a pretty deep green, but they're going to be very dainty. So I'm using the tip of my brush. I have this brush linked in the description box. It's what I've been using basically in all of these recent paintings because it's so versatile. It has a nice sharp tip. I'm going to start with that middle line down the very center, and then just going to add these little slightly curved lines coming from each little section. So every time there's a rounded area of this leaf, I'm pulling it down towards that center stem. Keeping a nice light hand, I'm not applying too much pressure, and gently adding these in all the way down. And there is our cute little oak leaf. I absolutely love these guys, and they're so fun because you can drop in any colors you want, and they all look so different. So moving on to our cute little ghosty guy, I'm going to start with a super light value of gray. It's pretty much just clear, but with a hint of gray. I'm using a bit of a mixture of carbon black and Payne's gray, and I'm just going to fill in this entire thing with a super light gray mixture. It basically just looks like slightly dirty water, but I want a nice even layer, and you can make your ghost shape however you want. Again, I have the sketch up on screen if you want to follow the one that I drew, but there's not only one specific way to paint little ghost illustrations, so you can be creative and have fun with it. But just go ahead and fill in this very light base layer. Now what helps bring this ghost to life is adding these shadows and kind of like a fabric texture. So I'm taking a slightly darker value, and this base layer is still wet. It's not overly wet, there's no pools, but it has some nice moisture to it. And I'm going to start gently adding in this medium value. It's not a super dark value of gray, but I'm going to add some of these little ripples. So they start kind of thin up at the top, and then as they approach the bottom of this sheet or the bottom of the ghost, it's getting thicker and thicker. And you can see that darker gray is slowly blending and bleeding out into the base layer, which is exactly what we want. And we're gonna just kind of build up layers as we go. I don't want anything to be super dark. They're just gonna be subtle little ripples of texture. So I'm gently lining the bottom, and then you can see each of these little ripples gets wider towards the bottom. So those are going to be the main folds of the fabric or the ghost texture, but I'm also going to add in some little wispy ones around it. So let's add one up here on the side. That's where the ghost is kind of folding over to the other side. Same thing here. Maybe I'll add a little bit of a darker shadow up here at the top, and I'll rinse off my brush and smooth out all of these lines. And as I go, I'm going to just be building up slightly darker values. Again, I don't want any that are super harsh or super dark, but I'm going to start to layer on slightly darker value of gray and building up some of these layers. Using the tip of my brush and adding on some of this texture. And as I go, I'm also going to add some additional little lines going up. And this just indicates that it's this very ruffled, ripply texture. So you can go back in with an even darker value at the very base of those. You can add in as many as you want. Don't go overboard to where the entire thing just looks messy or too squiggly, but feel free to add lots of nice texture here. And I'm gonna call that good. We're gonna let this dry completely, and then we'll go in with opaque carbon black or Payne's gray, any dark mixture that you have, to add in the facial features. So once it's all nice and dry, you can use a Sharpie if you want, you can use acrylic, gouache, or you can just use black or a dark mixture of watercolor. I'm using my carbon black. I'm using the very tip of my brush. This is the same size 5 round brush. And I'm gonna add 3 ovals, 2 for the eyes and 1 for the mouth. That's kind of like a shocked open mouth. So I'm gonna line it in first using the tip of my brush, barely applying any pressure. Those will be the 2 little eyes, and then a little bit of a taller, skinnier mouth. And once I have those outlined and it's looking good, the eyes are looking pretty even, then I'm just gonna fill it in with my black mixture. You don't have to fill it in if you don't want to, or you can leave a little white spot for the shine or a twinkle in its eye if you want. You can add eyebrows or cheeks or really anything you want here. I'm just gonna keep it pretty simple. And there is our shocked little ghost. He's not very scary, he's very cute. These are a lot of fun to paint. You can always change the facial expressions, you can change how they're moving, make them a little more squiggly. We're going to move on to the little acorns up next. Based on how we did the other projects, I'm sure you can guess what the first step of this is, but I'm going to start with a base layer of clean water. And I'm actually going to work on both of these little acorns at the same time. So I'm going to apply a base layer of water to just the bottom section. So I'm keeping the top section, the little acorn hat, if you want to call it that, nice and dry, and I'm just wetting this bottom section. And I'm going to take my warm caramely brown that I used for the base layer of the mushroom stems as well as the pumpkin stem, and I'm going to start layering that on. Again, kind of similar to what we did for the mushroom caps, I'm just adding it on the areas where I want it to be slightly darker. So the shadow underneath the little top of the acorn, the bottom, and then a little more so on this right side. So I'll go ahead and do that on both little acorns. I'm gonna load up a little more color here and start tapping that in. I wanna be able to build up colors, so I'm not starting super dark. This is still a fairly light shade. And just going to add that where I want the shadows to be. Rinse off my brush and start to blend it out. So we're getting to use a lot of the same techniques in these projects. Again, wanting to convey some highlights and shadows, but not go overboard to where any of these paintings look too realistic. I want this to just be a fun little sketchbook spread, so I am bringing all of these to life by adding a little bit of shadow and detail, but not going overboard. So I'm just gonna start to build up this warm caramely brown color. I'm getting slightly darker each time, but I'm maintaining this light value for the highlight. Now I'm gonna grab the darkest value of the same color, but just a little bit more concentrated. And as it's starting to dry a little bit, you'll get a little less blending. So that dark color where you want the shadows to be can stay a little bit more in place. You're getting a soft, gentle bleed, but not too much. And like I said, this is a great way to really practice your water control on these projects. And you'll get a better feel for when your paintings are starting to dry a little bit more and when you want to start to build up layers and how much water you want in your brush as you do this. So these are fun illustrations to paint, but they're also really great exercises for building up your water control and your watercolor muscle memory and just your overall skills. So I'm always working my way from light to dark anytime I'm building up layers with watercolor. You can always add darker layers on top of light layers, but I can't go in and lighten up areas that are already too dark. You can use the lifting technique if you have to, where you lift some color off the page. But if you know you're going to be layering, it's always better to start lighter and then add on to it as you go. So I'm gonna leave that be. We'll let it dry completely and then we'll add the top sections and then the details. Now I want to have a pretty stark contrast between the shade and the tone of the brown of the bottom of the acorn versus the top. So while this is a nice warm caramely brown, I want the top to be that same dark, bold, chocolatey brown that we used for the detail of the stem of the pumpkin and the darker shadows of the mushroom stem. And keeping this color palette pretty consistent will help make the whole spread, as we work our way across 2 different pages, it ties it all together because we're seeing accents of the same colors throughout. So once again, I'm going to start with a clean base layer, and I'm just going to do one at a time. I'll add in that base layer, and then I'm going to go directly into my chocolate brown, and I'm going to add that in. Once again, I don't want it to cover the entire top of the acorn. I don't want the entire thing to just be completely solid brown. So I'm going to leave some areas light as I do this. Going in with the dark, tapping that in, having some areas that are a bit darker, some that are a bit lighter, and I'll start to build up these layers just like we did on the bottom section. But you can see it's a beautiful contrast with this dark chocolatey brown and the warm caramely brown. And talking about chocolate and caramel is making me hungry. But I'm just going to start to build up this color a bit, always working from light to dark. So I don't want to go overboard adding too much of the brown right off the bat. You can always go back in and add additional layers. So I'm going to add that in, rinse off my brush and smooth that out. And we will be adding some additional layers of texture on the bottom section and the top section. But for now, I just want to establish where those dark values are and where the light values are. And we can't forget to add the little top of the acorn. So I'm going to add a tiny little stem up here using that same dark brown. And let's do the same thing on the one to the right. Starting with the base layer, grabbing our dark brown and building up layers. Once those layers are dry, we can add some final details. So for the bottom part, I loaded up a little more of my warm brown. And these aren't even going to be super noticeable, but I'm just going to tap in a little bit of extra shadow in some areas. The base layer is dry, so I'm not getting any bleeding. So this is wet on dry. And I'm just barely adding some texture here. And every time I add a stroke like this, I'm following the curve of the acorn. So I don't want any of my lines to be straight up and down or straight to the side. They're following the curve of the acorn and just building up a little bit of texture. So that's all I'm going to do for the bottom section. And then for the top, I'm just going to dip my brush into my chocolate brown. I don't want my brush to be too wet because I want to add some texture. And I'm going to get that by tapping my brush down. And you can see all these different types of marks that my brush is making on top of that layer that we already have built up. So it's a very subtle texture. But if my brush has too much water on it, it's going to start to pool and then the colors will blend and bleed. But all I want is these little random brush marks. And I'm just working my way across, still keeping it lighter in the area of the highlight and then a bit darker in these darker sections. And that's it. So really quick and easy steps, but that final little layer of texture really helps those elements pop. So we do have one more pumpkin on this page before we move to the right side, but we only have one new element to paint and then the rest are all repeats of what we've done. So I'm actually going to move on to the little maple leaf here, and it's going to be a very similar technique to what we did in this oak leaf. So starting out, I'm applying a base layer of clean water. And I have the sketch for this up on the screen if you want to sketch this out. And then using the same colors I did for the oak leaf, starting with that green, gold, mossy green, I'm going to tap some of that in and watch it bleed. Now, something I want to be careful of as I do this is I want to use the tip of my brush for these sharp little points of the leaf. So we had very curvy, round edges of the leaf on the other one. This one has very distinct, sharp tips. So you can be free and drop in color in the center of the leaf, but when you drop in your color on the edges, just make sure you're using the tip of your brush so that you can maintain those sharp little edges. But just go ahead and drop in some color, just like we did with the other one. You can really add in color wherever you want. There's not one specific way to do this. But I just want a good amount of this green, and then switching over to my red mixture and letting these two colors bleed and blend together. Remember, you can always re-wet the surface of your page. So if that initial layer has started to dry, you can see I'm not getting a whole lot of blending here. You can always just re-wet it and apply some additional water. And as I mentioned before, you can really use any colors you want. So I'm going more for the red and green. I'll probably add in a little bit of my cadmium yellow deep as well. But just have fun with it. Tap in color wherever you want. Make sure there's a little bit of white space and separation between them. At least for my preference, I wouldn't want it to get too muddy. There are some leaves out there, though, that look brown and kind of have a muddied color, so it's not a bad thing if you're going for that vibe, but I just like a little bit of white space between. That way I have plenty of room to get soft blends between each of these colors. And once the initial layer is down, I do like to go back over it again and really clean up the edges, because that's the best part about this type of leaf, is the very clean, sharp edges. It's almost like a holly leaf that's very sharp and pointy. So I go back over one more time using the very tip of my brush and clean up any edges, deepen any colors that may have muted as it dried. It's still fairly wet, but watercolors do dry a little bit lighter than when you first apply them on your paper. But I just want this to look nice and clean, so I'm sharpening up those edges. And you can see as I'm doing this, my base layer is starting to dry quite a bit. So I'm not getting as much bleeding as I did when I initially put the colors down. So in that case, I just re-wet my brush and soften it out. They're just kind of helping those colors blend and mesh without getting too muddy. Let's let this dry and then we'll add the stem and details. Once it's nice and dry, I'm using my chocolatey brown and I'm gonna add a little stem here. I'm gonna make it a little bit curvy and then it gets slightly thicker at the bottom. And then I'm going to go in with my dark red mixture and I'm going to add the little veins just like we did on this one. So I'll start by drawing a vein all the way up to the very tippy top. It's a little off center, but that's okay. And I'm going to do one main line coming from each of these three sections. So I'll add the final one coming up to the right. And then each of these little pointy tips is going to have a vein pulling into that center. So I like to pull mine down, so I start at the very edge and then I pull it towards the center. You can also go out if that works better for you. But just go ahead and fill in these little veins. They don't have to be perfect. You can also add additional little ones, even if they don't connect to anything. And work your way around, adding in these little veins. Okay, so at this point we've done two different leaves. We did the acorn, a pumpkin, and the little cute mushrooms. I think the mushrooms might be my favorite. But I'm just going to repeat those across the rest of the page. I'm not going to do it in detail. We've already done these in detail. I'm going to use the exact same techniques we've done. I might switch up the colors on this last little leaf. I might do a different color of pumpkin. Not entirely sure yet, but go ahead and work your way across your sketchbook spread. Add in as many of these elements as you want. If you want to add in some gourds or jack-o'-lanterns or any other type of fall elements, go for it. And then we'll meet back up because there's a couple final touches that I like to do anytime I work on sketchbook spreads like this, so we can do those together. But for now, just finish out your main elements and then we'll meet back up for the last little details. Ta-da! Okay, all the main elements on both the pages are done. They're looking cute. I think the spacing is pretty good. But there are a few last things I like to do. One of them is I like to add the color palette on one side of the sketchbook spread. That's always nice to do just to take note of any colors or color mixtures that you really like so you can reference it in the future. But before we do that, I want to add some little embellishments. And what I do for that, it's nothing too crazy, it's pretty simple, but I pick some colors that we've used throughout, so probably the orange mixture, the red, maybe some green, and I like to just add some loose leaf stems and little embellishments throughout in those white spaces to really fill it all in. So I brought you in a little bit closer. I'm going to use my size 5 round brush, and first I'm going to load up some of my green mixture. And I'm going to start adding some loose style leaves. And I don't want these to take away or distract from any of the illustrations we've done so far. I just want them to be complementary. So I don't want them to be too big. I don't want to add too many. But this is what it's going to look like. I start with the tip of my brush and I paint a little stem just like this. I like to give it movement, so I'm never painting my stems directly straight up and down or straight to the side. And then I go light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. I want it to be a little bit more of a round leaf, so I'm going to curve the edge like that. And I'm just going to add a few simple little leaf shapes coming off of this stem. I usually add maybe anywhere between 3 and 5 leaves, depending on the size of the stem. But that's about it. I might have one other little leaf coming off to the side. But I'm going to go ahead and add a few of these in the green shade throughout. Again, I don't want to fill every single white space, but I do want to have a balance. So while I have the green in my brush, I'm going to continue making green ones like this. Probably just do anywhere between 3 or 4. And then I'll do some orange ones, maybe some brown ones. But again, I don't want the page to end up looking cluttered. So I'm just going to find occasional white spaces, leaving plenty of room, and do another little leaf stem. And I don't want all the little stems to look the exact same. So they're going to look pretty similar, but I never want to have the exact same design that I did on a previous one. So I'm just using the tip of my brush to create the dainty stems, and then adding a few leaves on either side. And that's about it. Let's add 2 more of these. I'm going to move up in between the ghost and the acorns on the right hand side and do the same thing. Push down, lift back up to create each of these leaves, making sure I have good movement to them. As I said, I never want my leaves to be directly straight up and down or straight to the side. I always want to have some curve to give the illusion of movement as I add these little tiny embellishments. Let's add one on the very bottom right hand corner, starting with the tip and creating dainty little leaves. You can always create stems off of the main stem. So for example, I could have another leaf coming off of this one. Could have one with a little bit of a longer stem. But for the most part, it's the same style, but each little leaf stem looks a little bit different. So now I've loaded up some orange, and I'm going to do the same thing. I don't want any of my elements to be too close to one another, so I'm going to give some space, and I'll do the same thing, starting with the dainty stem like this, and then applying more pressure to create the leaf. And there's so much room for creative freedom in this part. If you want to make things a little more interesting, you don't have to do all the same type of leaf stems like I'm doing here. You can add little flowers if you want. You can add some pine cones. But I want to keep things pretty simple, so I'm going to continue adding in these dainty little leaf stems throughout this sketchbook spread. And as I mentioned, the last step I like to do is just adding a little color swatch of the color palette that I used. If there's a certain color mixture that I end up really liking, then sometimes I'll jot down next to the color swatch what exact colors I used and what the ratio was to get that color, and that way if I want to reference it again in the future, I can. Sometimes, in this case, I already know what these colors are. I've used it in a lot of different YouTube videos I've posted. But I still like to add the swatch. I think it just kind of ties it all together, and it's just kind of a fun look to add to a spread like this. So I'm not going to do every single color, but I'm just going to pick some of the main colors, the browns, the greens, and just go ahead and make a little swatch on the top right corner. So there is our completed sketchbook spread. I just love how this looks. There's such fun little illustrations. The whole spread looks cohesive. And the final thing I always recommend you do if you work on a sketchbook, or really it doesn't even have to be a sketchbook, any sort of piece, I recommend you sign and date it. I usually do it in the corner. And that way when you're looking back on old work, you know when it was you did it, you know it was you who painted it. And that way you can track your progress a little better too. I hope you had fun painting this autumn sketchbook spread. This will likely be the last fall theme tutorial I put out this year since we're already near the end of October, which is crazy, but I hope you've enjoyed them. I definitely have. And if you have any requests for other seasonal or holiday painting tutorials for the rest of the year, please be sure to let me know down below in the comments. Thanks for painting alongside me today, and I will see you in the next video.